The Sharp-Eyed Chicken Network is on the air. It's Chappie here, and tonight I want to talk about a subject that really annoys me a lot, just for the record, and that is the major hit musical on Broadway called Hamilton. It's hard to know exactly what annoys me most, but I have to say that it would seem to me that the person who wrote it, the people who produced it, the people who paid for it, the people who starred in it, and the people who love it have zero understanding of American history. Not any. Because if they did, they wouldn't be worshiping somebody who hated democracy. So I will drop back and talk more about that in a few minutes. Before I start on history, I have a little vignette to tell you. You know, I've mentioned that I worked in a gambling joint down on the peninsula for several years, for nearly a decade, and one of the things about those places were there were a lot of what I call natural philosophers, people who have paid attention. That's why they succeeded. Although, by the way, the gambling joints are the same as society. There's a tiny handful of people who make a living and everybody else is a loser. But anyway, except the house. One of my favorite natural philosophers was a guy who got tired of hearing losing stories, because typically in a gambling joint, most people want to tell you how well I played better, but the other guy won. Either the luck screwed me or cards, you know, something went wrong, or I was cheated somehow. And he would say, shake his head and say, "You don't seem to understand. Only conquering generals write history books. Nobody wants to hear about the losing side, and you don't ever anyway." So that's really what I want to introduce this subject for, because I don't think you can blame people for not paying attention in the history lessons, because I studied American history years ago, and I wasn't taught any of this stuff either. Apparently it's just not understood or properly brought forward, again, because the winners wrote the books. But recently, my recent research makes it clear that at the time of our founding, there was a very grave and enormous disagreement among the founders about what they were doing. A lot of disagreement. And I should start by saying that almost all of them had actually been educated in the old-fashioned way by learning fluent Latin and Greek and studying all the Latin philosophers and poets and writers. And they were very much taken with, if not besotted by, the Roman Republic, which existed roughly from 500 BC to 27 BC. Until it was, in their opinion, was destroyed by Julius Caesar, after which there were emperors, and it was a tyrannical sort of thing. But there was a kind of a golden age there in ancient Rome, at least for some of the people. And they had all studied Cato and Tacitus and all these various writers, Roman writers, and they were very much taken with the concept of that republic. So the first thing we want to understand is that there's a big difference between a democracy and a republic. Democracy, as the name implies, is a government run by the people, pretty much by the people, for the people. What our Declaration of Independence claims, because Jefferson was definitely a Democrat in the old sense of the word, in the original sense of the word. A republic, on the other hand, is a partial democracy, which is really run by representatives, often by an aristocracy under the guise of democracy. And someone asked Benjamin Franklin, after the dust settled, what had just happened, what had they created? He said, well, it's a republic if you can keep it, because most republics have always failed. But anyway, the main players in this contest were, on one side, Jefferson and Thomas Paine, who was writing Common Sense and other pamphlets and encouraging ordinary people to get involved in the revolution. On the other side were the people who were actually conducting the revolution, who were not ordinary revolutionaries in any sense of the word, because most of them were upper middle class or former aristocracy from England, and their real revolution was against King George and his taxation system. It was not really, they were using democracy as a screen, and they didn't really believe in it. In fact, John Adams and Alexander Hamilton together formed a group they called the Federalists. And they made no bones about the fact that they believed the aristocracy had to run things or we would have chaos. They believed democracy was mob rule, and they hated it. They were terrified of the concept of ordinary people. They were encouraged by a man named Edmund Burke, who was an English political philosopher who liked to talk about how when he was viewing the French Revolution, talk about how dangerous it is to think that janitors and hairdressers and ordinary people can have the power to run a government when they don't have any idea what the hell they're doing. They were not interested in democracy. And in fact, in order to get the Constitution passed, it was originally written by James Madison and by Jefferson and James Madison and also Thomas Paine in a very different fashion. It was a unicameral, one legislature, an elected leader who was short-term, and universal suffrage. And John Adams and Alexander Hamilton were passionately opposed to any of that. So what we have now, the system we have now, was actually devised by them, by Adams and Hamilton, with the things we're having trouble with nowadays: the Electoral College, the two senators for every state, no matter how many people they have, the limitations on the power of Congress to do things about the president and so forth. All these things were done to mollify the Federalists and to get them to agree to signing the Constitution. It was a compromise, but it was a compromise that was bitterly opposed by Jefferson and others. They really had this almost naive idea, the people on the left, of the power of what they were creating was going to be this wonderful revolution that would empower ordinary people. That's why government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and all that stuff was come from Jefferson's pen, not from these other guys. And in fact, there have been times in our history when either side of that conflict have been in ascendancy or not. But most of the time during our history, it has been the Federalist position, the representative, limited democracy concept which has ruled our country. And at the very least, we now have a Supreme Court that is dominated by those people, thanks to our friend Donald J. And I want to say that when Clarence Thomas and Alito and the others talk about originalism, they're talking about the viewpoint of Adams and Hamilton, not the viewpoint of Thomas Jefferson. I mean, Jefferson, for example, I've read a number of his letters. He wrote thousands of letters. They did a lot of letters in those days. And I've read quite a few of his letters. And in one of his letters, he famously said, then the Constitution should be rewritten every 19 years because every generation has different needs and different ideas. He said, thinking that you can have one set of rules for all time is like being an adult who thinks he can still wear a coat he wore in the 3rd grade. Wonderful line. And that was Jefferson would have utter contempt for these originalists. But we're stuck with it. And at the moment, they have taken over the Supreme Court. So it's going to be really interesting to see whether what effect that will have on the rule of law, because that's the ultimate arbiter of the rule of law in our country is the Supreme Court. And that was another thing that was passionately argued against in the earliest days, the idea that 9 men could have that much power over overruling Congress. And in fact, speaking of the rule of law, I want to just throw in one other thing that's part of this whole discussion, which is that former colonies, any former colonies, whether they're the United States or in Africa or Asia or wherever they are, basically look at the rule of law as a means of oppression. It was imposed by the colonizers as a means of controlling the people that they were taking over. So law is not a very popular thing in a lot of these places, and you can see it by where their governments keep breaking down. But one of the things that has happened in America is that we kind of always had a love affair with outlaws. Jesse James and Bonnie and Clyde and all these, because basically we're a former colony. And it helps to explain the appeal of Donald Trump, because he's proudly wearing the badge of an outlaw. He has only contempt for the law. And of course, the other thing, as we all know as we know already from previous discussions, is that he also appeals to people who have left behind by the tyranny of meritocracy. And in fact, David Brooks, in a recent column in the New York Times, pointed out that the Democrats make a mistake by thinking they can appeal to the Trump supporters on economic terms. Why don't they understand that that Biden has given them great increase in jobs and their wages are up and their situation is much better? Why don't they get that? And as Brooks pointed out, and we have learned from reading The Tyranny of Merit, they feel disrespected. They feel that they've been left behind. They feel that they're being considered losers, and so they end up, unfortunately, considering themselves losers, and they have a lot of anger because of it. Because I think, as I might have said, I wrote my friend David, who gave me that book, a note and said, any system which relies on merit is always going to have a relatively small number of winners and a relatively large number of so-called losers. And when they become angry enough or unhappy enough, all it takes is one clever demagogue like Donald to come along and convince them that he's going to save them, even though he has no interest in their welfare at all. So conflict was a very important part of the early formation of our country. It's not useful to think of it as some kind of idealistic romp, a big turn in history. It definitely is the most democratic constitution in the world, has been right along, although it doesn't always live up to its reputation. But there are still these restrictions that have been built into it from the get-go. And it kind of makes me really upset when I listen to the music from Hamilton and think of those people glorying in Hamilton as if he was some great hero of the Revolution, when in fact it was as far from a hero of the Revolution as it's possible to be. And in fact, his contemporaries, especially Jefferson, held him in utter contempt, because he did not believe that people in general should have a right to determine their form of government. It has been pointed out that the people of Wyoming have the same representation with 1/100th of the population of California. and that there's something basically undemocratic about that. And that's just one example. The Electoral College is another example where they basically set the Electoral College up to prevent the vote of the people from determining who the president was going to be. That's outrageous, but it's the way it is. It's built into our Constitution. And, you know, when I used to talk about how we need a new Constitution, but then it dawned on me, who's going to write the new Constitution? Is it going to be the elite that are the problem? And who else is going to write it? Just like our revolution was run by elite people who didn't believe in democracy, who just wanted to get King George off their back. There's a lot of that's built into the whole system. The congressional representation has been largely a function of population, so it's actually fairly democratic. It's like the House of Commons in England. Senate is more like the House of Lords, and you must know that until 1913 or something, the Senate was not elected by the people at all. It was appointed by the legislatures of the different states. The senators were not elected directly. That was part of the progressive movement that grew out of the excesses of the late 19th century, when there was a very major movement of progressives, and we passed the gradual income tax, which we didn't have before that, and we elected senators directly, and they created the Federal Reserve Board to try to put a handle on the economy so that it wouldn't constantly go through one catastrophe after another. For the last part of the 19th century, we had one national bankruptcy after another. About every 10 or 15 years, the whole thing crashed. But it's hard to sell the idea of true, full, 100% universal suffrage democracy when it doesn't work, when it works as poorly as it's working right now. It makes it difficult to sell the concept because there are too many people who, one reason or another, the failure of our educational system, their own disinterest, their own lack of interest in these things. But a great many people just don't seem to be interested in learning what they need to learn. In fact, I have often said, if we have a rather severe and difficult test to pass before you can become a citizen in this country, and we do, why don't we have the same kind of test before you can vote? I mean, if it's that important to make sure that somebody knows this American history and how our system works, because if you take a poll of people, they don't even have an idea how Congress is arranged, how laws are passed, how power is distributed in our culture. And we're also going through a period where this present Supreme Court is going to do their best with Trump's. If Trump is elected, you're going to see a basic radical change in the way the country runs, because up until now, civil servants have been exempt from political machinations because they realized that was appointing civil servants according to each new administration was just too chaotic. Couldn't do it. But Trump has made it clear that one of his plans is to destroy the civil service completely and just throw them all out and put in the people, the loyalists he wants in there. The Supreme Court is beginning to make it clear that the various government cabinet positions, the EPA and people like that, can't set regulations, that only Congress can set regulations, and they're undoing one after another of the environmental laws that have been passed. We're going through a very serious crisis now, there's no doubt about it. It's going to be, again, a very good test of the concept of democracy, because again, whether we like it or not, we have extended virtually universal suffrage, and we've given a lot of voting power to people who don't really have a good education or a lot of background in what they're voting on. They're voting emotionally based on what he's told them and on their own grievances. So I take some hope from the last midterm election, when it was widely reported that the Republicans were going to roll over everything and take complete control of the country. And they didn't. They won the House of Representatives barely by a very small majority, and they never did get the majority in the Senate. And part of that, we all know that part of that is because a great many people were unhappy about abortion. And part of that is because a great many people were concerned about Trump's behavior while he was president. We're going to have to see whether there are enough of those people around still to come out of the woodwork to get to vote when the time comes. It'll be interesting. But the parallel is clearly there. Trump is, in fact, pretending at least to fight their battles for them. So the parallel is exactly what you suggested. There's no question about it. Thank you.